to the 2022 Ralph B. Atkinson Award ceremony. My name is Arlene, Haffa, and I'm the current chair of the MontereyCounty chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. And as part of this, I'm the one just to tell you about Ralph B. Atkinson. Ralph was a chemist. He was born in 1907, and he went to MIT and he studied pigments and colors and all good chemicals that have conjugated double bonds. And then he went on to work for Eastman Kodak, and he discovered Kodachrome. And it was so sad to me yesterday when I was talking to one of my good friends, and she said, "What's Kodachrome?" I was like, "Oh, clearly, I'm getting old, because I remember even the song about Kodachrome." Ralph then left the East Coast, so he was in Boston, Massachusetts, and he moved to Los Angeles, where he became a cinematographer and won an Oscar award for the first color films to be developed. So he brought us vibrancy in all things sort of humanities-wise. One day he said, "What am I doing with my life?" And he just retired, sold his building, and moved up to the Big Sur coast. And he dedicated the rest of his life to exploring and solidifying civil liberties. Many of the people in this room have done the same. So if any of you are past recipients of the Ralph B. Atkinson Award, would you please stand up to be recognized? You can see in our program the list of past awardees. And it is a great honor that we're bestowing on Dr. Stephanie today. Joining a very formidable group. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Jennifer Chou. Jen Chou, I saw your name said Jen. She's a graduate of Wesleyan College, and while she was there, she was working on civil justice issues, even as an undergraduate. She was making sure that Asian American students in critical race studies were developed even at that early age. She then went on to the UCLA College of Law, and even as a student, she argued favorably a case in front of the U.S. Ninth Court of Appeals. She is now a staff attorney in charge of Gender, Sexuality, and Reproductive Justice program at the ACLU of Northern California. She helped pass the bill, the Menstrual Equity Act, that has now put feminine hygiene products in all of the restrooms, K-12 up through the community colleges, the CSU and the UC. When that change happened on my campus, a lot of the women in my department really sighed a big relief. I remember, as a young chemistry faculty member, having to keep them in my office because the closest place that was available was on the other side of campus. And if you missed the first part of lab, you were kicked out. And so it really is an equity justice issue that you worked on. And it's near and dear to me. She is also working to secure reproductive and LGBTQ+ justice for all California students. And I'd like to welcome her here to give her remarks.
So I'd first like to start by thanking the Monterey County chapter for inviting me. I've been with the ACLU for about 7 years, and this is my first opportunity to join the Monterey County chapter for one of its events, so I'm so pleased to be here with you all. And, 2022 was a pretty tough year for those of us working in the reproductive health, rights, and justice field. And the midterms were a really exciting silver lining to what has been otherwise a very dark period, at least for me. So the opportunity to kind of take some time and do a little bit of internal reflection about what the results of the elections mean, and then try to condense it for you all has actually been a really rewarding experience. I think the sort of mandate for me was to not just talk a little bit about sort of where this moment finds us, but also where do we go from here. But I'd also like to spend a few moments thinking about how we got here. And I know that sometimes in moments of great urgency, the instinct is to just push forward. And so it feels a little bit counterintuitive to want to stand still and look back. But I like to do this because, in part, for me, where I draw hope from is the full trajectory of the reproductive justice movement. And I'm hoping that by the time we finish today, that's something that you all can take with you too, is a little bit of that sense of hope. So I'll start first by talking a little bit about the 3 terms and concepts, which I think we've all seen before, right? Reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice. And I like to do this because I think most of the time we think about these 3 terms interchangeably, more or less. But I actually find it really helpful and important to think about these 3 concepts as distinct concepts. And so I'll just take a moment here to define them. So reproductive health focuses on the delivery of reproductive and sexual health services. Reproductive rights focuses on protecting the legal right to reproductive healthcare services. And reproductive justice is a broader concept that asks us to look at what social justice means in the context of reproductive health and reproductive justice, or reproductive rights. And I'll help connect the dots across these 3 in the next few slides. So first of all, what are the major landmarks we think of when we think about the reproductive rights movement? The right to contraception as established by the Supreme Court in Griswold and Einstadt, the right to abortion as established by Roe v. Wade in 1973 and later upheld and then narrowed by Casey and the 2 Carhart cases. And so when we think about sort of how we got to this point at the Supreme Court and what we think about as a broader reproductive rights movement, we often focus on these cases. And so the reproductive rights movement, as defined by these cases, squarely focuses on abortion and birth control, and more precisely on the legal right or choice to these services. And in a lot of ways, defining the reproductive rights movement in these terms ignored the needs of a significant part of our community, and namely women of color, women with low incomes, LGBTQ+ people, and women with disabilities, people who faced other barriers to accessing reproductive and sexual health care, barriers like discrimination in health care, cost, and the availability of resources and a health infrastructure where they lived. And in fact, these women often faced additional outright attacks on their reproductive decision-making. One of the cases that is not on this timeline, that is just as important in our country's trajectory of reproductive rights, is the Supreme Court's 1927 decision in Buck v. Bell. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Buck v. Bell, it held that the practice of involuntary sterilization was constitutional. And Buck v. Bell was not just an outlier. It was not just an outlier. It was not an outlier. It was actually reflective of a very, very popular movement throughout the 20th century. And in fact, from 1909 to the 1970s, California sterilized over 20,000 people through its compulsory sterilization law. Most of these were Black women, Latina women, and women in disabilities who were in state institutions, often against their choice. And so while today we don't question the harm of policies like Buck v. Bell, I do think it's worth noting that Buck v. Bell has never been overturned by the Supreme Court. And so these foundational cases make up the backbone of what we think of as the reproductive rights movement and the timeline of reproductive rights. And I think it's just important to spend a moment and reflect on that, because this is a movement and this is a timeline that has been defined and that defines itself solely on the basis of quote-unquote rights. And that means that it is also defined largely by decisions made by a singular body, the Supreme Court. And so I'm laying all this out not to say that the reproductive rights movement was bad, right? But to push us to think beyond what this movement could and should look like and how we should think about this. And offer that when we think about reproductive health rights and justice, focusing specifically on rights really limits our ability to build a vision of what reproductive freedom means. So that's why today we often talk, instead of reproductive rights, we focus on reproductive justice. And reproductive justice, for folks who aren't familiar with the term, is a movement developed by women of color, and particularly Black women, as a response to the narrative of reproductive rights in order to develop policies that were more directly responsive to the needs of all of our community members. And as you can see by this timeline, the work of the reproductive justice movement has been around for almost as long as the reproductive rights movement. However, the term reproductive justice itself was not defined until 1996, when a collective of women of color came together to articulate a broad framework that would transform the quote-unquote pro-choice movement into something that really aligned that work and that vision more closely with social justice. And that collective, which is known today as Sister Song, defines reproductive justice as the human right to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And so reproductive justice as both a goal and a conceptual framework requires us to look beyond Supreme Court decisions at the full picture of systems that ensure or deny our ability to meaningfully make decisions about our own reproductive freedom and decision making. And so you see where I'm going here, in that thinking only about jobs as the end of an era, which I think we've seen that in a lot of the coverage around sort of what comes next, is really limiting ourselves, and also failing to acknowledge not just the work that needs to be done, but also the work that has been done to really hold ourselves accountable to that broader vision. And that's the foundation I want us to have as we look towards what comes after these midterm elections, and also what comes after the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision. And so first, just a quick recap of what the Dobbs decision did. So Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization was a Supreme Court decision that was handed down in on June 24th of this year. And this is the Supreme Court's decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. And so in a 6-3 decision, the court overruled itself and found that Roe and found that there was not a right to privacy, a right to abortion in our right to privacy. And so what that decision meant for us in immediate terms is that the right to abortion is now entirely up to our elected officials. And many states acted immediately to resurrect old bans on abortion, or are in the process of enacting new ones. And so while some of these bans are currently being held up in court, we anticipate that by the time all is said and done, abortion will be illegal in over half of the United States. Now I want to be clear here. I often hear people say that the court's decision has made it so that states can decide what happens to abortion. But that's not entirely true. Obviously, states acted immediately in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision. But it is still entirely possible for Congress to act and make a decision about abortion. And right after the Dobbs decision passed, as you can see here from this article, this was written June 25th, conservatives in Congress immediately promised that if they do take power in Congress, the first thing that they'll do is push forward to vote on a national abortion ban. However, the good news is we're in California. And that abortion is still legal in California without restrictions. And in fact, we have some of the strongest protections in the country that continue to guarantee the ability of people to access abortion care. And we are so lucky to live in a state whose leadership had the foresight to act even before the Dobbs decision, to begin assessing what we need to do here in our state to not just protect abortion, but to really expand access to abortion. And during the last legislative cycle, we passed a historic package of bills and made historic investments, not just in funding abortion or sort of shoring up our legal protections for abortion, but also in investing in abortion providers, such as Dr. Taylor, who you will hear more from later. But that is absolutely critical, especially in a state like California, where studies show that thanks to bans in our neighboring states, there will be more than 1.4 million people of reproductive age whose nearest abortion provider is now in California. And estimates go as high as 16,000 people who will have to travel to California each year in order to get that care. And so more than ever now, we need to continue looking beyond Dobbs, and we need to continue challenging ourselves to hold ourselves to a bigger vision of reproductive freedom, one that is sustainable, one that sustains our infrastructure. And again, as reproductive justice advocates have been saying for generations, Roe was never enough. Roe was the floor. Thinking just in terms of rights, we would say that the Supreme Court's actions in Dobbs v. Jackson turned back decades of precedent, and in many ways felt like it brought the reproductive rights movement back to square one. However, when we look at this decision in the fuller context of justice, knowing that there's always more work to be done, knowing that there is a bigger goal, the decision in Dobbs, while devastating, feels less like the end. And so this is something that I personally like to hold on to as someone who has spent most of their career working on this issue. It is something that continues to push me forward. And so I will move on to the midterm election results. And I think this is the other reason why I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about reproductive justice is because I think a lot of the conversation from the election from earlier this week has been really focused on abortion. And abortion, of course, is important, right? And I think what we need to be talking about now is what we do from here. And so what happened on Tuesday is that abortion was the winner in this election, right? Reproductive justice was the winner in this election. California, Michigan, Vermont enshrined protections for reproductive freedom in their state constitutions. And voters in Kentucky and Montana overwhelmingly voted down anti-abortion measures in their state. And so this is the first midterm election since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And six times abortion has been on the ballot since Dobbs, and 6 times it has won. And as of last night, Prop 1 passed by 65.3%, winning of all of the state initiatives. This is the proposition that garnered the most votes, and I think we should think long and hard about what that means, and also how it's reflected in other elections too, because initial polling shows that where an abortion measure was on the ballot, voters turned out in larger numbers, and that impacted other races as well. So this is a map that I found really interesting from the New York Times, where they ran an analysis of sort of not just the ballot initiatives that were considered by voters, but like of all of the candidates that took a stance on abortion and reproductive freedom, how they fared and sort of where we are now in our national landscape after the elections, not just in terms of measures, but in terms of candidates. And for me, I think looking at these 6 states and also looking at this map, what I take away from this is that voters do deeply care about abortion and they deeply care about reproductive freedom. But what I found really interesting about each of those 6 races from the previous slide is that they ran campaigns that were state specific. That's how they won. They ran their campaigns from values up. And they ran campaigns that met their communities where they were at, and they talked to them about values. And I think going forward in this national landscape where states will have even more control over reproductive freedom than before, you know, it's going to be important for us to contend with what reproductive justice and right to abortion mean for individual communities. And that's not something we had to do under Roe v. Wade, where we had a federal protection for abortion care. So what I read from this is that we need to mobilize from a place of values and not just politics. And that's something that we in California know very well. California is a large state. We have over 50 counties. Each county has its own culture, its own way of communicating with each other. And so we know more than folks in other states that we need a more nuanced approach to our policies. And I think that is going to be more and more the case after Dobbs, after this election, in every election going forward. The expertise of folks on the ground, of chapters like this one, of people who are organizing in their communities, is going to be more and more salient in future elections, in the making of future policies. And so when we think about where we need to go from here, I encourage you to do that deep reflection about not just what these rights mean to you, but why they matter to you. To try to think about what you're aiming for in terms of a vision of justice. And when those policies do appear on your ballot, when they come before your elected officials, take action to support them. Call your elected officials, tell them why this matters to you, and also make sure that the laws that we already have on the books are actually being implemented, because again, like I said, California is a large state. Once you pass a law, that is just the first step, and we need to take more steps to make sure that people know what their rights are, that we are funding the implementation of those laws. One example is California's comprehensive sex ed law, which I included on this list because that's something that I've been working on at the ACLU for over 5 years now, and so it's something that I care deeply about. But California's comprehensive sexual health education law is one of the first in the country to really provide students with a holistic understanding of how to make healthy decisions. What it means to make healthy decisions for people of all genders and sexual orientations. And so it also requires students to get information about all of their pregnancy options in a medically accurate and unbiased way. And so for folks who care about abortion, who care about reproductive health care, this is a right that California students have. And it's important for us to make sure that they are getting access to that information. Donate money to abortion funds. California has its own abortion fund in the under Access Reproductive Justice, or find a fund where abortion is endangered. And again, educate yourself, educate those around you, not just about abortion rights, but about what reproductive justice means. So I'll close by saying that I think the bottom line is that, you know, that it's going to be, the next few years post-Dobbs is going to be challenging. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The picture for abortion rights, I hate to say it, but it is grim, you know, and I think it just underscores the work that we need to do. But we can draw hope from the folks in the reproductive justice movement. And as they say, the only way out is through. So, thank you.
There have been some advocates for pro-choice that lobbying the president Biden to set up abortion facilities at VA clinics and hospitals, and others advocating that tribes, reservations do the same. But some constitutional scholars are countering that they violate or would violate state laws that they have to comply with. Does the ACLU have a position on those strategies?
I think we don't have an official stance on the idea of building up federal clinics to provide abortion care. I think it's complicated. Obviously, the administration should be exploring every avenue for expanding care and expanding access to care. But I think that's sort of jumping the gun a little because, first of all, we have to remove the Hyde Amendment, which is currently requires congressional action to ensure that federal funding can go towards abortion care, because right now it can't. And the Hyde Amendment is something that has been attached to our federal budget for many years since, I can't even remember, it's been decades. But every year the Hyde Amendment prevents any federal funds from going towards abortion care. So I think it's definitely something that we need to explore, but that's not going to happen without an act of Congress first.
But I think in the end that the Supreme Court decision is going to make it a national deal, and that's what we need. Stop it all, go national, and get rid of the bad guys.
Right. I mean, I think it's very clear from the results of this election and how folks considered abortion in the context of state and federal elections. I think you're absolutely right. This is a moment to really educate folks and help people understand how this connects to our overall values as a progressive movement.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know there's at least one or more ACLU cases raising the freedom of religion as a reason why Dobbs was not a constitutional decision. That is, violating the freedom of religion of people who wish to choose abortion or have a different view of when life begins.
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think unfortunately it's complicated as a legal strategy because of the way that Trump completely transformed the judiciary, and the Supreme Court is not going to rule in any kind of way that favors abortion. Even if you're calling upon them to pull on these principles of religious freedom, the Supreme Court has proven that it is unprincipled, and that it is driven entirely by policy. And so, I think as a legal strategy, it's one that we're approaching with caution. And I think, sadly, that if we're hoping to get a good Supreme Court ruling that cuts both ways, and it's not something we're counting on. Yeah.
How do you think the post-Civil War amendment to prevent involuntary servitude would play into future cases? Because I think it was initially intended to prevent pregnancy of slave women to produce more children who would become property of the slaveholders.
Do you mean the involuntary sterilization?
No, servitude.
Servitude.
I think it's the
13th
Amendment.
That's an interesting question. I'm not really sure I'm familiar with that case, so I'm going to make a pin in that one.
Yeah, I think the theory is you're making slaves out of women, forcing them to bear children.
I think I've mostly heard of that case and conversation around that case in the context of carceral systems and the ways in which involuntary servitude is appearing for folks who are incarcerated.
All right, let's thank her again.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite chair up to the front. She will be introducing Dr. Stephanie Taylor. Jaqueline is a retired civil rights attorney and practiced from civil trial lawyer. She retired 7 years ago to become the director of the Mandel-Gisnet Center here at the Monterey College of Law. For those of you unaware, the Mandel-Gisnet Center is the alternate dispute resolution team for the Monterey Superior Court. And it engages in about 400 court-sponsored mediations per year. I'm also told that she's a Celtic fiddler, a jam leader, and a concert host at St. Mary's by the Sea. So I know of at least one other member of the ACLU that would really enjoy spending time with you.
Thanks so much, Arlene. Yeah, this is my office here. I didn't have to look up where to go for anything. So this is great. And I'd like to acknowledge Bill Monning, who was the first director of the Mandel-Gisnet Center. And I'd like to think of ourselves as the public-facing side of Monterey College of Law. And our mission is to provide access to justice in Monterey County. I am so honored to be here and to introduce our honoree. I'm going to get all emotional. I learned something about my friend Stephanie reading her bio that I didn't know about before, and that is that she has a doctorate in behavioral genetics. It explains so much about her and how she became the unique and insightful physician that she is today, committed to treating mind, body, and spirit. First and foremost, she's a scientist. Yay, science! Yay, science. With an inquisitive mind and a heart yearning to understand the human condition in all its aspects. I first met Stephanie over 30 years ago, and our paths just kept crossing. I believe we first met at a Planned Parenthood event. And then later, when I became a breast cancer patient and then advocate for breast cancer, we met again and again, and then I became a patient. Stephanie was wherever there was an issue requiring advocacy for health care, particularly with respect to reproductive rights. Her practice was a place of calm understanding, a really safe place. At her core, she is a teacher, as we can see from her many medical school classes. Her emphasis on education is evident in all that she does. Most recently, I have reconnected with Stephanie in a new and unique way. It is now not surprising to me that her early interest in behavioral genetics has also led her to explore the world of DNA and family history research. So much of who we are can be discovered by exploring our connection to the past. Uncovering the mysteries is also endlessly fascinating and has led to our mutual interest in all things Celtic, particularly music and language. Did you know that Stephanie is an avid student of Scots Gaelic, which is seeing a resurgence in Scotland? Well, I am retiring at the end of the year, and I have been clearing out my office and going through files. I found this anonymous poem that sort of fell out of a file that I was looking at, and I think I was meant to tell you about this poem today. It was given to me by another extraordinary health activist who recently passed, Sandra Kahn. Many of you probably knew her. It expresses the nature of the community that Stephanie has created through her practice and activism. While the poem refers to women, it is an old poem, and we're becoming informed about sex and gender, I think it expresses the thoughts and desires of all of us who struggle to make peace with our bodies and search for greater self-knowledge. Imagine a woman who believes it is right and good she is a woman who honors her experience and tells her stories. Imagine a woman who trusts and respects herself, a woman who listens to her needs and desires, who meets them with tenderness and grace. Imagine a woman who authors her own life, a woman who exerts, initiates, and moves on her own behalf, who refuses to surrender except to truest self and wisest voice. Imagine a woman in love with her own body, a woman who believes her body is enough just as it is, who celebrates her body's rhythms and cycles as an exquisite resource. Imagine a woman who honors the body of the goddess in her changing body, a woman who celebrates the accumulation of her years and her wisdom, who refuses to use her precious life energy disguising the changes in her body and life. Imagine a woman who values the women in her life, a woman who sits in the circles of women, who is reminded of the truth about herself when she forgets. Stephanie, thank you for creating a circle for us where we can express ourselves, learn, and grow. Thank you for sharing your intellect, compassionate heart, and healing art with us. Thank you for your advocacy for reproductive rights. You are most deserving of this award, my friend, and I also thank the ACLU for recognizing your life and work. Thank you.
So that was a beautiful introduction, and I was not aware of you until the rest of the board nominated you, and now I fully concur with all of their opinions. I'm glad to award you the Ralph B. Atkinson Award for 2022.
Good afternoon, everybody. Vanessa Gonzalez. I'm here on behalf of Senator Ana Caballero, who couldn't join us this afternoon, but I just wanted to say, Senator Caballero has been a champion for reproductive rights, and I know this year, as was mentioned, for elected officials that stepped up in California, she was an author of SB 1142, which asks for the state to provide funding for abortion services and research and tools for that other people coming into the state have access to that information. So I just want to congratulate you and thank you for your continued service in Monterey County on behalf of the 12th Senate District. Thank you for your dedication for years in supporting reproductive health and social well-being of the people in the community in Monterey County.
Representative here from Assemblymember Rivas' office. Assemblymember Rivas would also like to congratulate you on this award.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and also Congressman Jimmy Panetta.
He gets around, doesn't he? Thank you very much for this honor. I'm sort of surprised and taken aback, but I'll cope. I wanted to thank you all for acknowledging my 33 years of advocacy for women's health. It's really been 33 years. I can't tell you how much this recognition means for me. This is a perilous time for women around the world, and I can rely on the ACLU to counter those concerns and to be the voice of reason. But I want to tell you a little bit about myself first. I had surgery about a year ago. It was open heart surgery for an aneurysm that was in the aorta. And it went just fine, no problems. But then I had a major complication about 2 hours later. So I woke up paralyzed on the right side. So any hesitancy you might hear is just a little bit of residual from the stroke. People have said that I should have been scared when I woke up paralyzed, but I had really great faith in my operating team, and I was also determined to recover. I think that my work in Aikido and Tai Chi really helped a lot in that regard. And this is, I had my surgery in Cleveland, and because there are 2 specialists there in aortic surgery that were absolutely superb, and they did a really great job. I would have lost a lot more capacity if they hadn't been ready on the whole thing. But as you know, it's in Ohio, which is a red state. And this is the perfect introduction to my comments, because you can do life-saving cardiovascular surgery in Ohio, but be imprisoned for doing life-saving obstetric surgery, etc. Right? So
Wow.
it's that, and this is the dilemma I want to just briefly touch on, because you guys might not realize what the implications are for medical education for the current environment. Because it's a patchwork, and it's also unsettled, because a lot of the guys who are passing these laws don't really understand the implications of what they do.
Right.
Residency programs need to be accredited by the Accreditation Council for Graduate Education. That's a nationwide thing. And if you're not going to an accredited residency, you're not hireable, basically. You can't work. In the United States right now, there are 286 OB-GYN residency training programs. 45% of those are in the United States. And the council confirmed that abortion training was necessary in order to be accredited. And this puts a lot of the directors of those programs in a bind, because they're going to have to ship out that training to other people and to other states. So some of you guys are looking a little puzzled. So for example, somebody is going to school in Florida and as an MD and they're in the residency, that they need abortion training, they're going to have to go to another state to take that training and then come back.
Wow.
Okay. But that's not the answer either. You can't export the folks because the liability trails them. And you probably know that in some of those states, they have laws that against aiding and abetting. And that would be that would have a chilling effect on residents. So what the Right to Life folks are saying is that you get enough training in your day-to-day OB-GYN practice, you don't need to learn how to do terminations of pregnancy. But that's not true, because anybody who's a good surgeon will tell you that you need to have volume in order to handle rare complications. Right. There's nodding heads out there, right? Yeah, so you understand that. It's also having an adverse effect on recruiting faculty and residents in medical students. There are several cases where doctors have chosen to work in a state that permits abortion rather than expose themselves to liability for working in a red state. So this is the kind of entertaining solution. The Accreditation Council had a debate about what they could substitute for real-life abortion training. And they looked at simulation videos and also practicing on low-tech models of the uterus, including papayas. They decided that simulation was not an acceptable substitute for the real thing. So, from medical students, they invest a great deal in their training. And nobody's more focused than a medical student in moving ahead. So if they go to a program that might lose its accreditation because they don't offer abortion training, that's really a big problem for them. So they're tending to go to schools where there is abortion training, and that's creating a bottleneck at those schools. However, and this is all anecdotal for talking to folks, they will apply to schools that don't offer abortion training just because they really, really, really want to be OB-GYNs. And because it's the sort of thing that you just fall in love with. It's an irrational choice of a career. But when I did my OB-GYN training, I just fell in love with it. You can do surgery and medicine for women. And it's the only medical specialty that you can have both surgery and medical training. It's great. So an additional area of uncertainty is in vitro fertilization. If this becomes a patchwork set of laws, which is likely going to be, there's going to be real difficulties in determining testing, storage, genetic testing of the embryo, storage, disposal. I mean, you can imagine what questions that brings up, right? And then you know that self-managing abortion with pills is becoming very commonplace. But that's not the solution either, because what if she hemorrhages and she happens to live in the wrong state? If she seeks care, then she potentially looks at criminal prosecution. So the lack of specificity in the laws regulating pregnancy termination, as you can see, is due to a lack of understanding of the whole dynamic. And they said, well, you know, the folks who think they've got it under control say that, well, you know, if it's to save the life of the mother, everybody understands what that means. No, they don't. So after, well, delay, and that's why it causes delay in care. So there have been many, even though it's only been a couple of months, there are many times when delay in care has resulted in significant illness and or the death of the mother, because nobody's willing to act. So actually the decision has been moved to the doctor for when you should do a termination of not viable pregnancies, but the liability has also been moved to the doctor. And that makes the doctors really squiffy because they are very risk adverse. So I've given you a broad picture of the unintended consequences of passing laws without understanding the consequences, and the effect on quality care, staffing, residency program. I should point out that most of the, well, all of the folks who are in their residency are basically working for really cheap, and that's how you deliver care to the indigent folks. And so that's going to have a terrible effect on access to care of really, really poor folks who normally inhabit those clinics. So I hope I've given you an idea of the probably potential ramifications of this careless legislation. And I want to thank you again for the Ralph E. Atkinson Award.